Hi, everyone. This is Rose Horowitz, and I'm guest hosting tonight for Sree Sreenivasan. I'm proud, and it's my privilege for us to meet our two guests tonight, who are Washington Post reporters and are the authors of a top-selling book. You can find it on the bestseller list. It's Nightmare Scenario. The inside the Trump administration's response to the pandemic that changed history. So we will meet them in a little while, but first I'll just tell you a little bit about our show. Since March of 2020, when the pandemic started, we have Sree Sreenivasan and the team have been exploring the economic, medical and health and racial and social inequities of the pandemic. And we have done that with 525 guests. Proud to say that 303 of them have been women. And we've had 1.5 million viewers. The first 250 shows we did consecutively, and now we're doing them once a week. And tonight, before we meet our guests, want to tell everybody to follow us on Sree's Twitter, Facebook, LinkedIn, and YouTube channels. And we'd love to hear from you. We want to know where you're joining us from. And we'd love to hear any questions that you have for us and our authors. Ask us anything. Before I introduce them, just want to tell you a little about myself. I'm a journalist, and I'm a journalist and the founder of Woman to Follow. And want to thank the team that is making this happen tonight. Sree Sreenivasan is the Marshall Loeb Professor of Digital Innovation at Stony Brook School of Journalism. And our other producer is Vandana Menon, and you can follow her at Vandana underscore Menon, and she will be live tweeting tonight. And behind the scenes tonight, we are being helped by Neil Parrick, who is Vice President of Digimentors, and will be producing the show. So thank you to the team. And Digimentors, let me tell you a little about Digimentors. Digimentors is a full-service agency that does conferences, summits, webinars, talk shows. We can produce anything that you need digital, in person, hybrid, or remote. And we've been doing that for the pandemic. So just contact us and we'll be glad to help you. I also wanted to talk about things we have coming up that are by various Digimentor people. And on Thursday this week, our friend Stefan Kaplan is going to be doing his Spin It Social Hour, where he interviews a guest, and this week it'll be Charles Chesler. So please join Stefan on Thursday, July 22nd. And I am really proud and thrilled to announce that I am doing my own show. I will be launching my first edition of Woman to Follow, and I'll be interviewing Kirsten Alana, who is a travel photographer and blogger. So please join me on Tuesday, July 27th at 8 p.m. And this weekend, we will be having our usual New York Times read-along hosted by Sree and our guest, who is a senior editor of live news for the New York Times.
I didn't get that. Could you try again?
Sorry about that. So finally, I'm sorry. Next week for our show, we have Vishaka Desai, who is the author of World as Family, A Journey of Multi-Rooted Belongings. She is the former president and CEO of the Asia Society and a scholar at Columbia University. So please join us next week on Wednesday, July 28th for that show. So without further ado, I want to introduce our guests, Yasmeen Abutaleb, who is the health policy editor at the Washington Post, and Damian Paletta, who is economics editor at the Washington Post. They have joined together to present, to write a book that gives us an inside look, a bird's eye view of what really happened inside the Trump administration. As we remember, Trump first said that this whole virus was nothing. And certainly we know that it was a chaotic response. And they look at the players and the policies that brought us to where we are. And it of course was not nothing. As we know, we have over 500,000 people who have died from the virus in the US, and thousands more at risk who have died around the world. Fortunately, we have a vaccine, but we are dealing with new variants, and it's a continuing hot story. So I please welcome our guests, Yasmeen Abutaleb and Damian Paletta. Hi.
Hi.
Hey there.
Hi. Thank you so much for joining us.
It's so great to be here with you.
Thank you. So where do we start with your book? What made you want to? I mean, I know you were covering this, and you, from two different perspectives, the health policy and economics. And have you ever written together before, or written stories together? How did this come about?
Well, we haven't written together because I'm a reporter and Damian's an editor, but Damian was editing a lot of the early stories we were doing in January and February about COVID coming to the United States, and then when they implemented the China travel ban. So we were working together on those stories, and of course, a crazy breaking news environment. And by March or April, we didn't know exactly what course the virus was going to take. At that point, we still thought it might be over by the summer, with maybe a little bit of a flare up in the fall, but that we'd, be going back to work potentially later that summer. But we still knew that this was such a historic moment for the US, something that needed to be documented. It was clear in March and April that the Trump administration was mismanaging the whole response. And so we felt like no matter how things turned out, it was going to be worthy of a book, that there would need to be a comprehensive historical record of what was happening. And the twin forces that were constantly pitted against each other were the health and economic considerations. So there was the health advisors who were advising shutdowns and social distancing and masking, and the economic advisors who wanted the economy to rebound as quickly as possible, who wanted the shutdown to end, who were very resentful of the doctors and public health officials at many moments throughout the response. And so we felt like between the two of us, we could tell that story in a way that maybe other people couldn't.
Okay. And Damian, from your perspective?
Yeah, I think as Yasmeen said, I mean, we saw this from the get-go as a story that had a lot of obviously health and economic implications, and that the economics of this and the health policy of this could not be separated. They were really, so interconnected. And we thought, that we could bring a real unique vantage point to this. This is not just a political book about palace intrigue inside the White House. In order for people to really understand this, which we felt was important as like a historical record, we needed to really unpack the health and economic implications that, we feel strongly continue to this day with this Delta variant. There's a lot of confusion and hesitancy about what it would mean if we, shut things down again, or if we impose a mask mandate, or if restaurants have to scale back their customers, right? The health and economics of this cannot be separated even to this day. And so I think that's what Yasmeen and I really believed in initially. And as the year went on, we only felt stronger that was, what would make this a really powerful book.
And hasn't that sort of been at the core of the different states' response in that, aside from the political divide, many states say we have to bring our work, or we have to open our restaurants. We're dependent on tourism. So many businesses have shut down. So that will continue. How do you see that playing out? And are we in a better place, or are we going to be where we were last summer at some point?
That's a great question. I think it's still hard to tell. I think it's unlikely that we get to where we were last summer, just given the rate of vaccinations in the US. There is considerably more protection, even if people disregard public health guidelines. There is, of course, the concerns from the Delta variant. I think the upshot is that because 68% or so of Americans are vaccinated, that although there will probably be breakthrough infections with the spread of the Delta variant, the people who are vaccinated are at extremely low risk of serious disease. But Damian and I were talking about this just this week, what the Biden administration is going to do about the fall, because cases have already risen 70% in just a week. It's obviously much lower than any peak we experienced last year, but it is concerning. And there is a significant portion of the population, about 30% or so, that seems extremely resistant to getting vaccinated. The administration and some local health officials might be able to make inroads with some small segment of that population, but it's not going to be what we were seeing from January through May, with just millions and millions and millions of people getting vaccinated and massive increases, week over week over week. We're kind of past that point. And so I think when you ask about the tension of the health and economic forces, it's going to play out not on the big national level that we saw for all of last year, but regionally. There are a lot of states that, of course, have really low vaccination rates. And, they could be faced with very similar outbreaks and situations that they've been dealing with for the last 16 or 18 months.
Thank you. Let's see. My question for you is, before I'll just stop and just want to acknowledge some of the people who are tuning in and let's see where they're tuning in from. I think I saw Stefan Kaplan, who was tuning in from New Jersey. And there's Julia Weeks saying hello from Brooklyn. So far, we're close. Yeah, and Seattle, Washington, we have Pranya. And we have... I'm not sure, but her handle, but somebody from San Francisco is joining us. And Jonathan Borstein is saying hello from the East Village. Thank you, Jonathan, for joining us every day, every time we've done the show. And hello from Montauk, Long Island, from Apollo. Okay, so what there have been several books just out now about the COVID crisis and the administration. What makes your book unique?
Oh, that's a great question. Well, I think Yasmeen and I, we were immersed in this last year. We did not parachute into this story. We worked around the clock from, January 2020 all the way until we went on book leave on New Year's Day 2021. I mean, we were working on this, there were days when I started working at 7 a.m. and would finish at midnight or later, because the story just kept moving and changing. And so I think, while that was exhausting for us and our families, it also allowed us to really just absorb and vacuum up so much information. And I kept a detailed list, essentially a chronology that I updated every day of like the 10 or 12 things that happened that day related to COVID and the economy. And by the end, that document was hundreds of pages long. And of course, we couldn't include all of that information in the book, but it allowed us to go back through and say, wow, remember that crazy thing that happened in April 2020, 10 months later when we might have forgotten about it. And it helped us kind of structure our reporting and kind of prioritize events that really were important and integral to the government's response. And so I think, Obviously there needs to be a lot of books about this. This is one of the most important moments in American history. And in 50 years, we need people to remember what happened and to learn from the mistakes that were made. But I think what makes our book different is that we were, kind of riding the bull the whole time, with America. And that gave us a really unique vantage point in order to tell this story.
Thank you. And amazing dedication. I've been a beat reporter myself, and the more you're immersed in something, the more sources you have, and the more inside information you get. So if you can name me, let's say 5 or 10 things that stand out to you in how the administration handled this and how those were turning points. Is that something you can talk to us about? I'm sure, a lot of us don't want to remember what happened, but all I remember as we were doing our show, so I was always on top of what was happening, but it just seemed every day in terms of, my kids, one day I found a picture of myself where I was shopping in the supermarket and I was wearing, gloves, and, and then that turned out not to be the case. So if you can talk to us, name a few things that really stood out to you as you looked at what you wanted to cover in this book and what were turning points.
Yeah, Damian, I'm going to take a couple and then I'm going to hand it off.
Sure.
I'm not going to do all of them on my own. So I think one obvious one early on was Nancy Messonnier, a top CDC official, giving a briefing on February 25th, where she said, it's not a matter of if, but when. Life is going to change dramatically. People need to be prepared for massive changes to everyday life, school closures, working remotely. And it was a big turning point because the president was on his way back from a trip from India, and the market tanked on Dr. Messonnier's comments, which of course turned out to be right. And he changed the leadership of the task force to his vice president, Mike Pence, as opposed to the health secretary, Alex Azar. And it started this really frantic effort by the president. He had been doing it before, but I think you saw it really pick up after that date to tamp it down, to insist that this was going to go away. He very famously gave a press conference the next day saying, you see, it's 15 cases now, it's going to be down to 0, which of course is not what happened. And you really saw this shift to a public messaging campaign as opposed to a public health campaign or a public health response. I think another big one was the fumbled effort to decide whether or not Americans outside of healthcare settings needed to wear masks. And there was this proposal by a top HHS official named Robert Kadlec to have underwear manufacturers turn some of their facilities to manufacture masks. They had already started, they had already paid for it. And the plan was to send 650 million masks around to every household in America. So enough for about every American to have 2. And that plan got scuttled in the task force meeting because the vice president's chief of staff and other political officials didn't like how the masks worked. They said they looked like underwear, and they didn't want to panic people by sending masks to everyone. And of course, we saw what happened with the mask debate in the United States that continues to today. I think there's a lot of apprehension in re-implementing mask mandates because masks became such a divisive political wedge. And then I think another big one was when the vice president wrote the op-ed in June saying that there would be no coronavirus second wave, which of course turned out to be just patently false and completely terribly timed because we saw that massive summer surge. So I'll let Damian take the others.
Thank you. Damian?
Yeah, thank you so much. That was such a great list, Yasmeen. There's just a couple more that I would add. One is there was a meeting in the Oval Office over the summer where some of President Trump's campaign advisors told him that actually, a mask mandate for the country would not be as unpopular as he thought. In fact, about 80% of Republican voters would support a mask mandate if it meant that the economy would be able to reopen sooner. And so his campaign advisors told him this, thinking that if he kind of changed his messaging, it would lead to a lot of people thinking, he's on top of this, he's going to be forward leaning, maybe this is going to end after all. But in that meeting, Mark Meadows, his chief of staff, told the president, you cannot do a mask mandate, the base will revolt. And, this is around July or August 2020, and the president agreed with Mark Meadows. He didn't want to lose the base ahead of the election. And at that point, the masks just really became a huge wedge issue heading into the election. So that could have been a moment when
But
if
what
they
you're
had decided.
saying is that that in fact the 80% the vote the records were, or the polls were, that 80% of Republicans would support wearing masks.
Exactly, and would support his leadership in calling for mask wearing. They were looking for him to kind of lead the way. But we know that he was so, against even being photographed with a mask on or having people around him with masks on, because he thought it made people look weak. So, that was obviously something that a moment when, if I think in retrospect, it could have had a much different outcome. And then the final thing I'd mention is the end of the book, was a scene that was really special to Yasmeen and I. And essentially, it's a confrontation between Dr. Birx and the vice president. And it takes place 6 days after the election, when everyone in the Situation Room essentially knew that President Trump had lost re-election, but obviously Pence wasn't going to admit it or go down that road because the president was going to fight. And so Birx, who had been sort of biting her tongue to that point, confronted the vice president and said, "Listen, you have to tell people to wear masks. It's essentially the election's over. We have to really try to wrap our arms around this because the crisis is real." And at that point, there were, the numbers of people with coronavirus was starting to skyrocket. We were in the middle of this terrifying third wave. And Birx pleaded with the vice president, and he said, "Okay, I'll discuss it with the president." And she said, "No, you have to do it. You and the president have to call for this. Those people don't listen to me." And when she said those people, she was referring to, the millions and millions of Americans who would only take their cues from President Trump. And in retrospect, she was right. There was a huge kind of tidal wave of death coming. And there was no moment during that 10-week period between the election and the inauguration of Biden when the Trump administration, really tried to change its messaging in a way that would help people. And as you saw, there was about 200,000 deaths from COVID between November 3rd and January 20th. And it was just an unbelievable period for this country. So much sadness.
That's almost half the, 500,000 roughly deaths then in that period, when we already, when the rest of America knew that he had lost, right? What do you, one thing when I think of what happened in my mind is the whole thing about when he in fact, Trump got COVID and that scenario. What did that tell the nation?
Damian and I spent a lot of time trying to understand that weekend and that period where Trump got sick. And what we learned was that he was much sicker than his doctors and his political advisors were telling the public at the time. There was a period where they were genuinely concerned he was not going to make it alive out of that weekend because he was put on oxygen twice. It had dipped into the 80s. And they basically began this mad scramble, one, to get access to a drug that was not authorized for use at the time, the monoclonal antibody from Regeneron. They called the FDA commissioner directly and asked him to make it available through what's called a compassionate use application. And they wanted him to cut corners and do it in a matter of hours. He resisted, but by law, the FDA has to make a decision within 24 hours, and they did. And they did make that compassionate use authorization. The one person that we spoke with who was familiar with Trump's medical condition said that they thought that drug was the reason for his rapid turnaround, but they threw everything they had at him. They gave him remdesivir, which was in short supply at the time. They gave him dexamethasone, which is a steroid that had shown to have some efficacy against critically ill COVID patients. They, of course, gave him the monoclonal antibody, and he had access to the best medical team in the world. And what we learned, and I think Damian and I were really surprised to learn this, just given the president's behavior, is that his health advisors, including Robert Redfield, the CDC director, were really hoping that weekend was going to be this big turning point, that the president would finally understand how serious COVID was. He would come out, he would tell people to wear a mask. He would say, "I could have died from this. My wife got it. My son got it." if we can get it, then anyone can get it. And of course, that's not what happened. He walked up the balcony, he took the mask off in that very sort of dramatic, cinematic moment, and walked and exposed a number of White House staffers to potentially to COVID because he walked in without his mask, and was defiant and said, don't let it dominate your life. And Damian and I think were pretty struck by the fact that there was just so much regret among so many members of his staff at that moment, because they thought this was the moment he could have turned it around. It was October. They knew this really deadly winter was coming. And of course that didn't happen. And like Damian mentioned earlier, 160,000 people died just in the stretch from the election to the inauguration.
Thank you. Let me see. What did it mean to you? I guess, one of the images that I'll never forget is him taking that ride. What did it tell America about how to be safe when Trump took the ride with his security people around the hospital? I mean, it's just theater. I guess the main question that I'm sure you explore in your book is, how much of the Trump administration's response, was driven by health concerns, and how much was driven by how this would look and how he would look, and how it would position the Republicans for the election in 2020.
Well, I mean, he's a master showman. He really is, and I think his skill in marketing and messaging. I don't know of another president who that. And so absolutely, there was, at the beginning, we all saw that he tried to kind of will it away. It'll disappear when the weather gets warmer. It's not going to be a big deal. When the stock market tanked initially, as Yasmeen mentioned, they did everything they could to kind of talk it back up. They sent Larry Kudlow onto CNBC to say, it's pretty much airtight, contained. And then there was a point when it became obvious that, you can't trick the virus, right? You can't just change the channel on it. And then the virus, by the time they had realized that, obviously it was like a month too late and the virus was everywhere. And so there was a point in March, in kind of the second half of March, when the president acknowledged that, this is going to be tough and we need to kind of unite as a country. And quite frankly, his poll numbers at that period were as high as they'd ever been. Because I think Americans realized that this was a crisis that kind of snuck up on the country, and that he was trying to lead, and sort of gave him the benefit of the doubt for that 2-week period. And then in early April, there was a huge fight over reopening, and this, there was these protests in states. Armed people, stormed into the state capitol in Michigan, and all sorts of things. And the president really lost patience with the precautions. And so I think at that point, he was really trying to take to cable news and do whatever he could to try to spin this in a way that made his base feel better. I think as you mentioned, that ride he took around Walter Reed on I think it was the Sunday that he was there. I think he was trying to show America that he was indestructible. That this virus that had killed at that point more than 100 people wasn't going to kill him. And as Yasmeen mentioned, he was on so many drugs at the time, including steroids, that made him feel better than he probably was, that he felt that he needed to send that message to people. I mean, it was amazing considering how sick he had just been, that he was able to do that. Now, sure, obviously put Secret Service agents at risk, and quite frankly, send a signal to millions of people that the virus was no big deal, and that you can kind of dust yourself off and get right back up and at it. So I think, that's something that we'll maybe never know, the damage that ride caused, that publicity stunt caused. But absolutely, it was his way of telling people that this virus would not beat him, that he was going to not, kind of fade away in the final month of the campaign, and that he was going to get after it and do whatever he thought was right, no matter what the doctor said.
Thank you. A question, that was in March, and he made that famous speech, which, as I'm listening to you, if he was full of steroids and he made the speech in front of the White House, he seemed like he could have been on steroids, right? But question, how did what happened in June with the murder of George Floyd, all along there, this pandemic pointed to the huge inequalities in healthcare in our nation, and then we had this killing of George Floyd, which only just pointed more to also the racial inequities. Do you talk about that in your book, and can you tell us about that?
We do. Damian and I have a whole chapter about the George Floyd protests and the protests that whole summer that resulted in calling for greater equity and addressing systemic racism more head on than the U.S. had in the last few years. And of course, these were all an extension of the Black Lives Matter movement that had started a few years earlier. But we also talk about how those protests were in many ways exacerbated by, like you said, the disproportionate toll that COVID was taking on communities of color. No one was safe from the virus, but the truth of the matter was that affluent people were more protected because they more likely had jobs that they could do remotely for long periods of time or indefinite periods of time. So they could stay home and protect themselves, have groceries delivered. You had the financial means to sort of get through the pandemic however they did. Whereas people with lower incomes, and in many cases, these were people of color, had essential worker jobs where they had to go in, they had to expose themselves. Of course, grocery store workers were one of the most at-risk groups throughout the duration of the pandemic, just because of the amount of exposure that they had every day to all sorts of people. And of course, there was trouble implementing mask mandates in lots of parts of the country. So there was so much anger and resentment that the government was not really addressing this problem head on, wasn't directing resources to the communities that needed it most, wasn't even talking about it that much. They had Surgeon General Jerome Adams, who was one of the only Black cabinet members of the administration, go out and talk about it for a little bit, but then he had this gaffe where he started getting yanked off TV after that because he had just become too much of the story. And so you saw in these protests, there was anger from, of course, the murder of George Floyd and how brutal it was, and that everyone could watch that horrible video, but also that they felt like the government had been ignoring the massive toll that this virus was taking on people of color. I think Black people were 3 times as likely to die from the virus. I think it was a similar rate for Hispanic people, and they had these jobs where they couldn't be protected. They were getting hit the hardest by the shutdowns and the economic downturn. And so you saw all of that just boil up into these protests over the summer. And we thought that was such an important moment because, of course, it was one of the biggest civil rights movements we've seen in many, many years. But also it was a way for us to really explore the unfairness that this virus sort of wreaked on everyone, and how it really exacerbated already massive inequality in the country.
And I would just add to that. I mean, I think Yasmeen and I, that was a very difficult chapter for us to write. It was called From Bad to Worse, and it's one that we're really proud of. The other side of that, obviously, they were African Americans, Hispanic families were much more likely, as Yasmeen mentioned, to be exposed to the virus because they could not stay home and work remotely in a lot of cases, and also
they didn't have access to healthcare, of course.
Exactly, but the other side of that is they couldn't get tested as easily either because there were drive-through testing sites. First of all, they were not likely to be able to get off work to do this, and second of all, a lot of the people who needed to be tested didn't have cars to drive to the drive-through testing sites. So it was almost like they were much more susceptible to getting sick and dying because of underlying health conditions in a lot of cases. There was a higher prevalence of African American and Hispanic families living in multi-generational families, where if someone who's younger brought the virus home, they could get a grandparent sick, with disastrous consequences. And then it was much more harder for them to be tested. And so it was just like this terrible scenario. And so when you get to, I think it was May 25th when George Floyd was murdered, you get to that point, the country had been cooped up for months. Everyone's kind of getting, stressed and needs a haircut, and they can't everyone's just kind of, all get all this pent up tension. And then with the murder of George Floyd, the country just explodes. And I think one of the most, telling things for us is when that happens and everyone spills into the street, that's when Dr. Fauci realizes the only way we're going to get through this is if we're a united country, and we are not a united country. We're anything but. And so the country kind of fractures into, as Yasmeen mentioned, a few weeks later, Vice President Pence writes that op-ed, there will not be a second wave in the Wall Street Journal. The second wave is just beginning, and, kind of all hell breaks loose from there.
Exactly. Very, very good analysis. I just want to say hello again and acknowledge all the people who are watching and asking questions. And I'd like to maybe read a few of them. One of our viewers has asked, public health workers have been getting death threats. Why aren't we seeing arrests? And somebody is asking more specifically, did they catch the person who made threats against Dr. Fauci?
Those are great questions. Damian and I did ask that question a few different times. And as far as we know, they did not catch the person who sent the letter full of powder to Dr. Fauci. There was an investigation. They did try to find out, but they, as far as we know, did not find the person who was responsible for sending that, which of course is really scary. It was fortunate that it turned out to be a hoax, some sort of cosmetic powder or something. But of course, as we report in the book, there was this moment where Dr. Fauci really thought he could be in serious trouble or even be dead if it was ricin, like he thought was one of the options. For the public health workers, I think that there sometimes have been arrests, but the problem is with death threats and conspiracy theories, so much of it happens on the internet, so much of it happens anonymously, that it's really not that easy, I don't think, to make arrests. And I think we've also seen in many parts of the country that there are segments of law enforcement, not all over, of course, it differs place to place, but, I think we just saw yesterday, I think it was yesterday in LA, where they said that they were going to implement mask mandates again, and the local sheriff, who wasn't responsible for implementing it in the first place, said that he was not going to enforce the mandate because he thought it was government overreach. So, there is this really stark divide, depending on where you are in the country, of how people feel about these things, how they feel about public health workers, how they feel about mask mandates and social distancing. So I think that's another part of the challenge as well.
And I think one of the things Yasmeen and I tried to do with this book, you mentioned Dr. Fauci and powder. I mean, so the prologue of the book is a scene in August. When
one of our viewers apparently, has read the book and
yes, and thank you.
Yes.
I really appreciate it. So the Dr. Fauci brings an envelope that had been sent to his house, and he takes it to the office at the NIH and opens it with a letter opener, and all this powder explodes all over his face. And as Yasmeen mentioned, they didn't know it could be ricin or anthrax or a hoax. And so he had to be decontaminated. He was stripped down to his underwear. It was, a very scary moment. And I think what we were trying to do in that passage for readers is show people, we all lived through 2020. Okay, we know some of the bigger plot twists and stuff, but you have no idea how crazy it got. You have no idea how close the calls were. You have no idea how fraught this year was and how crazy and scary and emotional it was. And it wasn't just Dr. Fauci who got a letter with powder. Dr. Redfield got a letter with powder. Dr. Birx was getting letters telling her to hang herself. I mean, there was obviously a lot of public criticism leveled at these doctors, some of it from the president, from the podium and from his Twitter account. But it ended up manifesting itself into some really nasty, dangerous stuff. And that continues to this day, quite frankly. I think Dr. Fauci might have a security detail the rest of his life just based on the amount of hatred that's been pointed at him from some of the president's supporters. So I think one of the things we wanted to do with this book was say, listen, we're going to take you to a place that you didn't know existed. We're going to tell you stories that you couldn't have dreamed of. And it's really important to understand that if you really want to comprehend what happened in 2020.
So you're taking us behind the closed doors.
And amazingly, I think Dr. Fauci's facing even worse threats now than he was last year. The moment that we were writing about that seemed so exceptional, and that this must have been the worst point. And I think it's even worse now because you've seen an even bigger segment of the right wing go after him, and even more conspiracy theories with the Wuhan lab and NIH. And, we're going to see the repercussions of this for many, many years to come. It's by no means over.
One of our watchers, Sudha Parag, is asking, well, writing this book, both of you must have gone through a lot of emotional stress. If you're working 18 hours a day and writing this book, Tell us how you got through it and how hard that was. Damian, you want to, Yasmeen, you start? I don't know. Whoever.
Go ahead.
I feel like, I mean, yes, Yasmeen got me through the stress. My family got me through the stress. It was incredibly stressful. I mean, we're first-time book writers, okay? So it was stressful on its own. But we were dealing with the same things that everyone else was dealing with. We had COVID scares. My great aunt died of COVID in November. I have 2 kids who their school was affected. I waited in line at the grocery store for 2 hours, like bewildered at what I was seeing happen to the country. I mean, it was incredibly stressful. I think, it was, I could not have done it. I could not have done it without an amazing partner. Because, when I had my kind of worst days, Yasmeen was there to pick me up. And, we just kind of both stubbornly forged ahead, I think. But absolutely, it was an incredibly hard thing. I think, though, in a weird way, it was the stress that helped get us through. We knew how important this was. We knew that this was a story that needed to be told. And
did you feel like you were working on adrenaline?
Yeah, there were times. Yeah, we kind of crawled across the finish line, I think. But we were working with an amazing editor at HarperCollins, Jonathan J. who's it was just a blessing, and he really kept us on track, and we were just determined to get this done. And there were some books that the band played on about the AIDS pandemic and the Great Influenza, about the Spanish flu, that we used as kind of goals. Like, we want to have our book stand alongside those at the end of the day and be the definitive tale of COVID-19. And so as the crisis got worse and the deaths piled up and it got even nastier and scarier, it made us all the more determined to, get it done and make sure it was like the best that it could be.
Yeah, I think Damian hit on a lot of it. We definitely helped each other through, supported each other through. We both had families that were very supportive of the book and wanted to help us get it across the finish line and understood the importance of it, which doesn't mean it wasn't without its challenges. And I think Damian and I also had moments where we would feel really stressed, but also recognized the point of immense privilege that we were both in. One, to get the opportunity to write this book and get to document it for history, but 2, that we both had jobs that we could do remotely. We could do the book remotely. We could get on Zoom. We had good internet connections. We kept our incomes. And I think we sometimes talked about, if we feel this much stress, I can't imagine the amount of stress that people who are suffering the hardest from this pandemic are going through. And we both had scares that I think made us completely sick a couple of times throughout the year, because we both had at-risk family members. I remember feeling for a long period of time, and not until my parents and a lot of my loved ones were able to get vaccinated did I stop feeling like, death and illness was kind of lurking around every corner. I think we're all going to be dealing with the trauma of the pandemic and what we had to endure for so long. It's going to take a long time to process it. I think Damian and I are just starting to process it, because we've just been able to start slowing down a little bit from the book and the frenetic reporting pace that we were at last year. But it was really hard. It was really hard to feel the fear that we felt for our families, for ourselves, for the country. And then at the same time, just be uncovering one disastrous decision or meeting after another, or feeling like that things were not going to get better, at least not in the near future. And I think that was a really difficult feeling to cope with for a long time, especially by the time the fall rolled around. It felt like, I don't know that I've experienced a darker winter than this past winter, with the enormous death and infection toll and the chaos with the election and not a lot of messaging about COVID, and the start of the vaccination campaigns was such a disaster. It was so hopeful that we had these vaccines, but then the rollout was a disaster. It was a really, really dark period that we all had to live through.
Yeah, and this is such a good question. We could spend the whole time talking about this. And it's good for me, like in terms of therapy, to talk about it. This was not a book we worked on from 9 to 5. Okay, we were like living this book. the whole debate about masks, like that affected us too,
Right.
and we wrote a whole chapter about it because it was so important. We had several COVID scares in my family, and so the whole testing debacle. For example, my wife, 2 kids, we had to go get tested. It was a really scary moment, and the 4 of us got tested together. Myself and one of my children got our results back in 2 days. I think my wife's results came back 5 days later, and then the other child's came back like 10 days later. I mean, what the heck was that? And I think that was something that thousands of people were going through every day.
Yeah.
And the fact that it was so broken and that long into the pandemic, it made, I think it made Yasmeen and I realize there's no way we're going to get through this if they don't sort all this kind of stuff out. And this is just the basic, one of the most basic parts of the whole response is like finding out who's sick. And so that just made us more determined to get this right and to hold people accountable who were responsible for these decisions and some of these mistakes. And so, I kind of fantasize about writing a book that I can do from arm's length and, spend years on and, do like that. This was not the kind of book. This was like we were riding the bull for over a year. It was crazy. It was stressful. It was emotional. It was hard, but we just knew it was important. And, we just kind of kept, picking each other up when we needed to. Our families were amazing. Our colleagues at the Post were incredible. And, that's what the finished product, that's how it got to be.
Well, thank you so much. And I think I just want to reflect, one of my sons is telling me to go. Mom, it's the first time I've co-hosted the show, but I haven't fully hosted the show. So thank you, Andrew. He's in DC, and we have comments. Jeanette Ashworth, I think, thanked you for this brave and important work you've done. And she writes, yes, so much collective trauma from this pandemic. I want to read your book. Thank you for researching and documenting so much. Neil Parek's mother writes, salute to both the authors. Great history of this era. I have a few kids, sorry. Anyway, and we went through this pandemic as well, so all affected, one of them got COVID, but, didn't find out until, he had random tests in college and had it, but didn't believe it. But anyway, had to spend a week in a dorm with, where they put meals at the door of his dorm.
Lunch is okay.
Yeah, he was fine. He was asymptomatic. He had gotten one vaccine, had waited at a CVS and got the Pfizer vaccine. And so this happened like a week and a half later. So he thought maybe he got it online. His theory. He missed a swimming season, at college. And we have a comment from Diana in San Francisco. Thank you so much. Thank you for the amazing information. Jonathan Borstein saying, important book. Thank you. Jeanette Ashworth, who teaches, wrote, the lack of accountability and the rejection of science were surreal. Thanks for your deep dive. I guess I have a question. If you're writing, you want this to be like there was a definitive AIDS, sort of AIDS book, and was part of that to give to your own children that they would someday see that your book would be the history of this terrible time?
Well, I think
you probably haven't thought of that yet, but.
Well, we did. We did spend a lot of time. Our families were along for the ride, for sure. So I think, we thought it was a lot of political books, quite frankly, kind of like cotton candy, and they evaporate soon after publication. And we wanted to write a book that had a shelf life and that, was buzzy and important and, got people's attention now, but they will come back to, quite frankly, that colleges might use as part of their curriculum, and that
Mhm.
people will, heaven forbid, that when there is another pandemic, which there will be, that they can turn back to Nightmare Scenario and remember and refresh, their memories about what happened. And so I think we wanted this book to be able to stand on its own. And it's been a few weeks. The reviews have been great. We'll see where things go from here. We're still in the middle of this pandemic, and we're kind of moving in the wrong direction, quite frankly. But we think that this book does do that. The mask debate that we talked about. They had the same debate in 1918. And we forgot they were making the same arguments. People were killing each other over it, and it happened all over again 100 years later. So, I think it's important.
I was surprised. I saw the polio. There have been the black and white pictures I saw of polio people. Having to get them in schools, and it is. I'm sure the kind of pictures of people waiting in line to get tested, or waiting 2 hours in front of a Trader Joe's or a supermarket, or and empty subways, in New York City will be a part of history. So we thank you for your contribution. And the book just came out on June, tell us again, June
29th.
29th. So we're just about 3 weeks later, and you're on the bestseller list. How does that feel?
It was surreal. It was great because we were together when we found out. We were doing an event for the book, and knew that we were going to miss the news during the event, so we'd know as soon as we finished. And I think we just gave each other a huge hug, and we're so relieved because we knew the book was important, and I think we really hoped it would have a shelf life. And one of the things that we really tried to avoid is, I think there's this narrative that it's all Trump's fault, and if only we had had a different president, things would have gone differently. And the truth is, it was going to be hard no matter who was in charge. And we wanted to get beyond, obviously Trump was a huge element. You can't do a book about 2020 without looking at him. But we wanted to look really deeply at some of the other key people in the response, take a really deep dive into some of the health agencies and some of the things that went wrong without the president, like the CDC test, and why the US fell so behind on testing, and the issues with the vaccine, which of course you can't separate the president from. But we wanted to avoid an overly simplistic narrative, because there are lessons to take away outside of just presidential leadership, which of course is hugely important, but there's more to it than that. And I think we were so happy that it resonated with many more people than we expected. And that even though we're still living it, even though the dust has by no means settled from this, we thought there might be some fatigue and that people might not be ready for something like this, but that there is this hunger to understand and learn more about what went wrong and what went right. The vaccine was a huge success in many ways, and why it happened and what lessons can be taken away from that. And so I think we've just been really overwhelmed and humbled by the reception, and just really grateful that we got to do this.
Do you hope that the book will help inform policy as we go forward from the CDC and FDA, and looking at them? I mean, we know the mistakes, but that this book will help shed light on the things, as you said, that we did right and that we did wrong, and how we can move on from, go forward at this point.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's so much more important than being on a bestsellers list, is to think that our book could be part of the response to the next pandemic, that our book could, prevent mistakes, that our book could save lives. I mean, what an amazing legacy that would be for Nightmare Scenario. If it helped stiffen the spine of some scientist, or it gave some politician pause before they did something populist that might end up, being very destructive. I think that would be, our dream scenario, quite frankly.
So the book is really complex, because, it's not just a look at Trump and him, taking that ride around Walter Reed, or, it is a very complex, as you so wonderfully have talked, have showed us topic. So I'm sure it will live on. And what's your next project? What's your next book?
We haven't even had a chance to talk to each other about what's next yet.
Okay.
And, I mean, I think for our day jobs, we're talking a lot about and trying to look a lot at the anxiety around the Delta variant and what this fall is going to look like. That's obviously not the same scope as the book, but I think we need to take a little bit of a breather, figure out what's happening now and hopefully sort of get out of the woods on this pandemic. But we obviously still have a lot of work in covering this one and how it's ongoing.
I really appreciate your patience. We're still getting questions from viewers. So Spoxobrain is her handle on Twitter, is asking, can you talk about the people in the administration who intentionally blocked good policy?
Yeah, it's a good question. So I think, Yasmeen gave this really good example about a meeting at the White House early on where underwear manufacturers were going to produce hundreds of millions of masks to distribute to every American through the U.S. Postal Service. And, the masks, as she mentioned, some people looked like someone was wearing underpants on their face or a training bra. And so the whole idea got shelved because of, kind of the image of it, that people thought it didn't look right or it looked silly. And so I think it was those kinds of decisions about, appearance or what the base thought or might think, these political decisions that really were short-sighted and in retrospect probably really damaging to the response. There were many decisions that ended up kind of breaking down along kind of a libertarian view or a scientific view, and these warring camps within the Situation Room. And I think we're still living with the legacy of that now. The fact that there were these different narratives emerging from the White House, sometimes at the same podium on the same day, split the country into two halves. And that's what we're seeing now with, this vaccine hostility from so many Americans who just are confused about whether the vaccine works because they're hearing different things from different people and they don't know who to believe. And so the legacy of all of that from last year continues. And as Yasmeen mentioned, that's what we're spending a lot of our time on now at the Washington Post, is understanding what's happening in the country, explaining to readers what's happening and who the decision makers are, and trying to anticipate where this goes next, because it's mid-July, the fall is right around the corner, and that's when a coronavirus picks up a lot of momentum. And so if we're at the same trajectory in the fall that we're at now, we could be in for a lot of trouble. And so it's those sorts of lessons that we learned last year that we need to remind ourselves of now.
Thank you. Jasmine?
I mean, I think Damian hit on so much of it, and I just want to say that we're really grateful that we could come on and talk about the book and some of the lessons that we learned from it, and we still have a lot more to learn. And we just, encourage people to reach out to us as they read it with any questions or thoughts. And I'm just really, really grateful that we got to come on and talk with everyone here.
Well, thank you so much. I'm going to ask you to just stay on for a few minutes as I'm going to go back to some announcements we have, and then I'll ask you to stick around and ask you for some closing thoughts. So thank you so much. We'll be back to you soon. Okay. So thank you, everybody, for joining us. I want to give a big shout out to my colleague, Vandana Menon, who I know has been tweeting live under Vandana _ Menon. So please follow her. And we give shout out to Sree for being such a great host and showing me how to do this. And a big thank you to Neil, who stepped in at the last moment to help produce this show, and always does an excellent job. Just mention the shows we have coming up. First, Thursday, please join Stephen Kaplan for his Spin It Social Hour. And on Sunday, please join Sree and Neil, who's the executive, one of the other producers, and our team of 4 other producers who make this show happen. And we'll be talking to Shashank Bengali, who is the senior editor of live news for the New York Times. He's a former foreign correspondent for the Los Angeles Times and is based in Singapore, but has also spent time in Mumbai as the South Asian bureau chief. And last but not least, I'll ask the final pitch will be to watch my show. As I've been doing this show, I've guest hosted. Some people have said, well, when are you going to do your own show? You know, I started a movement to amplify women's voices on social media. This Tuesday at 8 p.m., I'm going to be interviewing a great travel photographer and blogger, Kristen Alana, who I'm really excited to have. She is not only a photographer, but in her blog posts, she really engages with her viewers. So she's a woman to follow, and looking forward to that. And on next week for our next Sree show, we're going to meet a fascinating woman, Vishaka Desai, who is the author of World as Family, A Journey of Multi-Rooted Belongings. Ms. Desai is the former president and CEO of the Asia Society and is a well-known scholar and advisor at Columbia University. So that should be a very exciting show. And now if we can bring on our guests again and ask them for some final words. Hi. So thank you so much again for joining us, and appreciate your patience as I've navigated this hosting. But what would we have had a lot of questions about, why they haven't found the people who have made these threats, what's going to happen in the future. But, what is the message you might want to leave to people who are going to want to read your book? What would you want to say to our viewers?
I think it's just really important to understand what we all lived through, why it went the way it did, and to really think about what lessons we can take away from it, how we can hold our government and our institutions and state and local leaders more accountable so that we never have to live through something like this again. When Damian mentioned earlier that we look to books like In the Band Played On about the AIDS crisis, I think one thing that book did really well was obviously look at what the Reagan administration and Reagan himself did wrong in that crisis, but look beyond that to the doctors and the scientists and the institutions that didn't respond as quickly as they should to that crisis. And the same thing happened here. So I would just urge people to, I know it's tempting to, especially if you're vaccinated, to want to move on and feel like we've gotten through this and get to move on. But there are millions of families that have suffered irreparably from this. I think the country suffered irreparably from this, and to just stress the importance of really understanding what happened so that, because we all have a role to play in making sure that the next time goes better. It's not in the hands of a few people. I think one thing that we learned in this crisis is that every single person has a role to play in helping and protecting society. And that was ultimately one of the things that was really detrimental to this response, is that there were a lot of people who didn't believe that it was their problem or their responsibility. So I would just urge people to read it, to share it, and to heed whatever lessons we can from this whole crisis.
Thank you so much. And I'm sure after this show and replays that people will be watching, I encourage everybody to get this book. And Damian, let me turn to you.
Sure. I would just add, Yasmeen and I have gotten a lot of feedback on the book that, wow, you have all this amazing inside detail. It was, it's crazy to feel like you're in the room for some of these things. And I think Yasmeen and I feel that people deserve to be in the room. They deserve to know what happened. I mean, one of the things that we felt was important about writing this was to shine a light on how the decisions were made, and quite frankly, how some of the, terrible decisions were made and why they were made. And so, this is, we tried to write it, as a page turner. We wanted people to really be immersed in these scenes, whether it was the Oval Office or Air Force One or the Yellow Oval Room on the second floor of the White House. But people deserve to know what their government does, especially in moments of crisis. And so we hope that this book, fulfills that need, because there will, like I said, there will be another pandemic, and we need to all not forget what happened. And hopefully our book, really cements this for a long time.
Well, thank you. That's a really noble mission. I know myself as an investigative reporter, I think my proudest achievements were feeling that I did bring my readers into the room, and some of my stories did change, legislation, and so I think that you really understand that, and I really admire your wide-ranging and important goals. So thank you so much for joining us, and I really hope the book continues to soar and do well, and will make us all understand this crisis better. Thank you.
Thank you, Rose.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.